November 17th, 1942. Morning. Gafsa, Tunisia. Captain James Mitchell of the United States 1st Infantry Division stood in the captured airfield's operations tent, reading the intelligence summary with growing satisfaction. His battalion had taken the town without firing a shot. The Germans had fewer than 500 troops in all of Tunisia, according to the latest estimate. "We'll be in Tunis for Thanksgiving," he said to his executive officer, grinning. What Mitchell didn't know was that at that very moment, the 53rd transport aircraft of the day was touching down at Tunis El Aouina airfield, carrying another 70 German soldiers and 3 tons of ammunition. The mathematics were staggering. Between November 12th and November 30th, the Axis powers would fly 581 tons of supplies into Tunisia. Over 15,000 men would arrive by air in less than 3 weeks. By the time Mitchell's unit attempted to advance toward Tunis in early December, they would face not 500 defenders, but an entire panzer division supported by fighters and bombers that outnumbered Allied aircraft in the theater by ratios approaching 4 to 1. The transformation was absolute. What began as a dash against negligible opposition became a grinding stalemate that cost hundreds of lives and dozens of tanks. By Christmas Day, 1942, the Allies would be driven back to their starting positions, the early momentum completely dissipated. The Germans had accomplished in 6 weeks what military planners considered impossible: the establishment of a fortified bridgehead across the Mediterranean in territory the Allies assumed they would control. 3 weeks earlier, the planning had seemed sound. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, had succeeded beyond expectations. On November 8th, 1942, American and British forces landed at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers with minimal resistance. The Vichy French forces, after brief fighting, had agreed to an armistice. General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters in Gibraltar buzzed with optimism. Intelligence reports indicated that Axis forces in Tunisia consisted of perhaps a few hundred men, mostly Italian caretakers at airfields. The race was on to seize Tunisia before the Germans could react. Mitchell had served in North Africa for exactly 9 days when his unit received orders to jump at Aix-les-Bains on November 15th. At 32 years old, he was considered an experienced officer, having trained paratroopers in Georgia for 18 months. His men were among the first American airborne forces to see combat. The briefing was straightforward: secure the airfield, push east to Gafsa, then continue toward the coast. Expected resistance: light to none. Expected timeline: Tunis by the end of November. The American command structure believed they understood the strategic picture. Tunisia was the final piece of North Africa not yet under Allied control. With French Morocco, Algeria, and Libya's western approaches now friendly or contested, Tunisia represented a narrow corridor that, once closed, would trap Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from Egypt and the new Allied forces pressing from the west. Every military principle suggested the Germans would abandon Tunisia or defend it with minimal forces while evacuating Rommel's army. Holding Tunisia made no strategic sense when the supply lines across the Mediterranean were vulnerable to Allied air and naval power. These assumptions rested on what seemed like ironclad logic. The British controlled Gibraltar and Malta, dominating the sea lanes. Allied air forces from Algeria could strike shipping routes. The distances from Sicily to Tunisia, 180 kilometers at the closest point, seemed prohibitively dangerous for sustained supply operations. The German High Command facing catastrophe at Stalingrad and strain on every front, could not possibly commit significant forces to what appeared to be an indefensible position. The British First Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, moved with appropriate caution given these assumptions. 2 infantry brigade groups and 1 armored regimental group, perhaps 7,000 men total with supporting tanks, represented a force calculated to overcome light resistance without overextending supply lines that already stretched hundreds of kilometers from the landing beaches. Speed mattered more than mass. Get there first. Secure the ports and airfields. Prevent Axis reinforcement. On November 11th, the British 36th Infantry Brigade landed unopposed at Bougie, 300 kilometers east of Algiers. On November 12th, the British 3rd Parachute Battalion captured Bone Airfield in a dawn assault, dropping from transport aircraft in the war's first combat jump by British paratroopers. Number 6 Commando secured Bone's port the following day. The advance continued with remarkable ease. Jejeli on November 13th, Tabarka on November 15th. Each objective fell like dominoes. No Germans, few Italians, cooperative or indifferent French colonial administrators. Mitchell's jump at Aix-les-Bains on November 15th went flawlessly. His battalion secured the airfield by noon, suffering 1 sprained ankle as their only casualty. The facility was pristine. The French had maintained it carefully, with fuel stores and ammunition dumps intact. Mitchell established his command post in the control tower and sent patrols toward Gafsa, 60 kilometers to the east. On November 17th, his forward companies entered Gafsa without opposition. The town's French garrison, uncertain of allegiances, offered neither resistance nor support. Standing in that operations tent on November 17th, reading reports of continued easy advances, Mitchell felt the satisfaction of a plan unfolding perfectly. His men were in good spirits, casualties were nil, and the enemy was nowhere to be found. Intelligence summaries confirmed the picture. Minimal Axis presence, demoralized Italian forces, confused French colonials. The path to Tunis lay open. What Mitchell was reading, however, was information already 4 days obsolete. The first revelation came that afternoon, delivered by a British liaison officer who arrived by jeep from the north. Captain William Hargrove of the British 36th Infantry Brigade looked exhausted, his uniform dusty and torn. He carried a dispatch case containing reconnaissance photographs and after-action reports. Mitchell offered him coffee, real coffee from American supplies, and asked about the situation near the Tunisian border. "We hit Germans yesterday at Jebel Abiad," Hargrove said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. 17 tanks, panzers, and about 400 infantry with anti-tank guns and mortars. Proper defensive position, well sighted. We couldn't budge them. Mitchell frowned. 17 tanks? That's a company strength unit. I thought intelligence said the Germans had maybe a battalion total in all Tunisia. Intelligence is wrong, Hargrove said flatly. He opened the dispatch case and pulled out photographs. These were taken yesterday by a reconnaissance Spitfire over Tunis. Have a look. Mitchell studied the aerial photographs. They showed Tunis El Awina airfield, 4 kilometers from the city center. He counted aircraft, once, twice, 3 times to be certain. The numbers stunned him. Fighters lined the runway in neat rows, 20, 40, 60, 80. Transport aircraft crowded the taxi areas. Anti-aircraft positions ringed the field. Supply dumps sprawled across several hectares. How many aircraft is that? Mitchell asked. We counted over 100 yesterday morning, Hargrove said. This morning's reconnaissance reported 130. They're flying them in constantly. Ju-52s from Sicily, Mi-109s, Italian fighters. The transports are bringing in troops, guns, ammunition, fuel, everything. Mitchell did the calculation automatically. If each transport carried even 50 men, conservative estimate, and they were making multiple trips per day, then hundreds, perhaps thousands of German soldiers were arriving in Tunisia daily. If this had been ongoing since November 9th, when the first German aircraft arrived, then the force in Tunisia was not 500 men. It might be 5,000. It might be more. This can't be sustained, Mitchell said, more to himself than to Hargrove. The British control the sea. Our fighters from Algeria can reach Tunis. They can't keep this up. That's what the brass thinks too, Hargrove said. But the Germans aren't using ships. They're flying everything. Low altitude over the water, fighter escort, quick turnaround to Tunis. Our fighters from Bonn and Souk El Arba are too few, and the distances are too great. The Luftwaffe has local air superiority. He paused, drawing on his cigarette. And they're using it. Our column was strafed 3 times yesterday, lost 2 lorries and 6 men. The Germans are choosing their targets, hitting our supply lines, slowing our advance. Meanwhile, they're building strength. Mitchell looked again at the photographs. In the operations tent at Gafsa, 700 kilometers from Algiers and 300 kilometers from the nearest Allied air base with significant fighter strength, the implications crystallized. The race was not between Allied ground forces and Axis reaction. The race was between Allied logistics crawling overland through bad roads and Axis logistics flying directly across water. And the Allies were losing. "What's Anderson ordering?" Mitchell asked. "Push forward. Secure Tunis before they get stronger. We're to advance on Jadeda and Majaz al-Bab." Hargrove's voice carried a tone Mitchell recognized, the sound of a soldier following orders he considered questionable. 11th Brigade is already moving. We're to support from the south. Over the following days, the reports arrived with increasing frequency, each one contradicting the assumptions that had shaped the operations planning. On November 19th, French General Louis Barré, commanding several thousand colonial troops who had been technically neutral, established a defensive line from Tebersouk to Majaz al-Bab, refusing passage to both Axis and Allied forces. German General Walter Nering, newly arrived by air to command Axis forces in Tunisia, demanded passage through Barré's positions. When refused, Nering attacked with tanks and infantry. The French held twice, then withdrew after heavy casualties, recognizing they could not maintain neutrality against determined Axis aggression. Mitchell received the report on November 20th. The implications troubled him. Barré's colonial units numbered perhaps 8,000 men with artillery and light armor. If the Germans could defeat such a force in a day, then German strength in Tunisia was not measured in companies or even battalions, but in divisions. The mathematics demanded it. A company, 200 men with supporting weapons, could not have overwhelmed Barré's defenses. A battalion might have attempted it, but would have required days and suffered prohibitive casualties. Only a force of several thousand men with substantial armor could have achieved what Nering achieved. The pattern was emerging. Every contact with Axis forces revealed strength exceeding intelligence estimates. Every reconnaissance flight showed more aircraft at Tunis. Every prisoner interrogation confirmed fresh arrivals from Sicily or Italy. The trickle of reinforcements that Allied planners had anticipated as manageable was in reality a flood. On November 26th, Mitchell's unit received orders to prepare to move north to support the British advance on Jadeda. The briefing materials included updated enemy strength estimates. Possibly 5,000 German troops in Tunisia, organized as regimental combat teams with tank support. Mitchell noted that just 10 days earlier, the estimate had been 500, a tenfold increase, and even this revised figure felt conservative given the accumulating evidence. The same day, British 36th Infantry Brigade reached Jaffna after struggling through heavy rain that turned the roads into mud. German aircraft struck the column repeatedly. Later reports described an ambush. German infantry with anti-tank guns positioned in the hills, firing at close range, destroying vehicles, and inflicting dozens of casualties before withdrawing. The British 11th Brigade entered Majaz al-Bab unopposed, only to face a German counterattack on November 27th that captured 286 prisoners and forced a retreat. Mitchell read these reports in his tent at Gafsa, trying to reconcile the vision of easy victory with the reality of determined resistance. His executive officer, Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, a 24-year-old from Massachusetts, spread maps across the planning table. "Sir, if the British are running into this much trouble at Majaz al-Bab, which is still 50 kilometers from Tunis, what happens when we try to push through to the coast?" Brennan traced the route with his finger. "We're even further from supply bases. Our air cover is minimal, and the Germans are getting stronger every day." "We follow orders," Mitchell said. But privately, he shared Brennan's concern. The optimism of early November had given way to something else. Not quite fear, but recognition that the operation was not unfolding as planned. The scale became undeniable on November 28th. British 11th Brigade, reinforced with tanks from the United States 1st Armored Division, assaulted Jadeda, only 30 kilometers west of Tunis. The attack failed. 19 American tanks were destroyed or disabled by German anti-tank guns and panzers. Mitchell received the casualty report that evening. 47 dead, over 100 wounded, significant equipment losses. The Germans held Jadeda and immediately began fortifying approaches to Tunis itself. Mitchell studied the map late into the night. Jadeda represented the closest Allied approach to Tunis. If forces only 30 kilometers from the objective, supported by armor, with artillery preparation, could not break through, then the German defenses were formidable. Not improvised, not makeshift, formidable. The next 3 days brought further confirmation. On December 1st, Major General Wolfgang Fischer's German 10th Panzer Division, a complete division, not regimental fragments, launched a major counterattack toward Taburba. Mitchell read the name twice. 10th Panzer Division. A full mechanized division implied 15,000 men, hundreds of tanks, complete artillery batteries, engineer companies, logistics, support. The existence of such a unit in Tunisia, assembled in less than 3 weeks, contradicted every assumption about Axis capabilities. The attack succeeded. British 11th Brigade fell back from positions it had spent a week securing. Allied counterattacks over the following days made minimal progress, losing more tanks and artillery pieces. The offensive momentum had not merely stalled, it had reversed. Private First Class Robert Santos, a radio man in Mitchell's company, had been monitoring communications between forward units and headquarters. On December 3rd, he approached Mitchell with a troubled expression. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "Go ahead, Santos." "Sir, I've been listening to the traffic from the units near Taburba. The British commanders are reporting German strength at brigade level or higher. Multiple tank companies, full infantry battalions with heavy weapons, artillery batteries coordinating fire. This isn't a holding force. This is an army." Mitchell nodded slowly. "I know." "Sir, with respect, we were told we were racing to grab Tunisia before the Germans could react. But they did react. They reacted immediately, and they're still reacting. Every day more troops arrive. Every day their positions get stronger. We're not in a race anymore. We're in a siege, except we're the ones outside the walls. The observation was accurate. Mitchell had reached the same conclusion, but had not articulated it so clearly. The operation had transformed from a rapid exploitation into a grinding campaign. And the Allies were unprepared for such a campaign. Their supply lines were overextended. Their air cover was inadequate. Their force structure was designed for speed, not sustained combat. "Keep monitoring those communications," Mitchell told Santos. "Let me know immediately if anything changes." Over the following 2 weeks, Mitchell watched the campaign unravel through fragmentary reports and orders that increasingly emphasized defense over offense. On December 10th, his unit finally moved north to occupy positions near Gafsa's defensive perimeter. The expected push toward the coast never materialized. Instead, headquarters worried about German counterattacks pushing south. The documentary evidence accumulated in Mitchell's files told a story more comprehensive than any single battle report. Captured German documents revealed the scale of the airlift operation. A logistics summary seized from a destroyed German vehicle showed that between November 9th and November 30th, the Luftwaffe had flown over 900 transport sorties into Tunisia, delivering 15,200 men, 500 tons of ammunition, 43 anti-tank guns, 27 artillery pieces, and enough fuel and rations to sustain operations for weeks. Mitchell calculated the implications. 900 sorties in 21 days averaged 43 flights daily. If operations continued at this pace, and intelligence suggested they were accelerating, the Germans could sustain or even increase their forces in Tunisia indefinitely, limited only by aircraft availability and fuel supplies. Meanwhile, Allied ground forces advanced overland at perhaps 30 kilometers per day, under good conditions. Much slower in bad weather or when facing opposition. The advantage lay entirely with defenders using interior lines and air transport against attackers constrained by surface logistics. Every kilometer the Allies advanced stretched their supply lines further. Every kilometer the Germans fell back shortened theirs. The geometry favored the Axis. A captured German officer, Hauptmann Friedrich Wolf of the 10th Panzer Division, provided testimony during interrogation on December 8th. Mitchell attended the session, curious to hear directly from someone on the other side. "We arrived on November 21st, Wolf said in accented but clear English. "My company flew from Sicily in Ju-52s. The flight took 90 minutes. We landed at Tunis, unloaded our equipment, and were in combat positions by evening. The next day, my company had full ammunition loads, hot food, and orders to advance toward Taburba. Your forces had been in Africa for 2 weeks and were still struggling to move supplies forward from Algiers. We had been in Tunisia for 24 hours and were fully operational. The operational tempo was entirely in our favor." "Did you expect to be evacuated?" Mitchell asked. "Did you think Tunisia was a temporary position?" Wolf laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The opposite. We were told Tunisia was the key to holding North Africa. If we held Tunisia, we held Tripoli's flank. If we held Tripoli, we held Libya. If we held Libya, we stopped your advance. Every week we delay you is a week to strengthen defenses, a week to evacuate critical supplies from Tripoli, a week for the Eastern Front to stabilize. No one told us to prepare for evacuation. We were told to dig in and fight." The paradigm shift was complete. Tunisia was not a consolation prize the Germans would abandon. It was a strategic position they intended to hold with everything they could commit. And they could commit far more, far faster than Allied planners had imagined possible. Mitchell's psychological transformation occurred in stages. The first stage was confusion, a feeling that reports must be exaggerated or misunderstood. German strength could not be what witnesses claimed. The second stage was doubt, as accumulating evidence made dismissal impossible. The third stage was acceptance, crystallizing during a conversation with a British intelligence officer on December 10th. Major Richard Pemberton, assigned to Anderson's headquarters, visited Mitchell's position carrying updated assessments. He spread reconnaissance photographs across Mitchell's desk. Images of Tunis El Awina airfield taken that morning. Mitchell counted aircraft, over 150. This doesn't count the aircraft at Bizerte or Sfax, Pemberton said, or the ones that landed yesterday and departed for Sicily after unloading. Current estimate of German ground forces in Tunisia, 25,000 men. Italian forces, another 10,000. Total Axis strength, 35,000, organized into proper divisions with full supporting arms. Mitchell felt something shift in his understanding. 25,000 Germans. In 5 weeks, the Axis had transported and organized a force that equaled or exceeded the entire Allied strength in Tunisia. They had done this while under nominal Allied air and sea superiority. They had done this across 180 kilometers of open water that Allied strategists considered nearly impassable for sustained logistics. How did we get this so wrong? Mitchell asked. Pemberton sighed. We assumed Axis logistics were as constrained as ours. We assumed they faced the same problems with distance and supply that we faced. But they don't face those problems. They have short supply lines across water, defended by fighters we can't contest because our bases are too far away. We have long supply lines over poor roads, exposed to their aircraft. We assumed the Mediterranean was a barrier for them. It's actually a highway. And we assumed Tunisia was indefensible. It's actually easier to defend than to attack if you can sustain forces there. He paused. We planned for the wrong war. We planned for a race against time. But time was on their side, not ours. Mitchell thought about the early optimism, the intelligence estimates showing 500 Germans, the orders to dash for Tunis, the confidence that speed would overcome strength. Every assumption had been inverted. The Allies were not arriving first. The Germans were already there. Speed was not an Allied advantage. Axis air transport was faster than Allied ground movement. The Germans were not caught unprepared. They had reacted with remarkable speed and efficiency. What happens now? Mitchell asked. We hold what we have, build up supplies, wait for reinforcements, try again in spring. Pemberton's tone was flat, devoid of the enthusiasm that had characterized briefings in November. This is going to be a long campaign. That night, Mitchell wrote in his diary, a practice he maintained sporadically, recording events he thought significant. The entry for December 10th, 1942, captured his mental state. We are not liberating Tunisia. We are besieging it. The difference is profound. Liberation would have taken weeks. Siege will take months. I think of the men we've lost already. Hundreds dead or wounded in battles for villages and hills that don't appear on most maps. I think of the confidence we had on November 17th, believing Tunis was within reach. We were wrong about everything. The Germans were never absent. They were assembling. We were never racing them. We were walking into an ambush. The mathematics were always against us. But we didn't see it until we were committed. On December 16th, elements of the United States 1st Infantry Division raided Maknassi in southern Tunisia, capturing 21 German prisoners. Mitchell received the after-action report. The raid was tactically successful but strategically meaningless. A gesture toward maintaining offensive spirit in a campaign that had turned defensive. The final push came on December 22nd. The 18th Regimental Combat Team of the 1st Infantry Division and the 2nd Battalion Coldstream Guards attacked Longstop Hill, a dominant terrain feature near Tunis. The hill was taken on December 23rd after fierce fighting. Mitchell, monitoring radio traffic from Gafsa, allowed himself brief optimism. Perhaps momentum was shifting. The optimism lasted 24 hours. On December 24th, German forces counterattacked with fresh units, recently arrived by air from Sicily. By Christmas Day, the Allies were driven back to their starting positions. Longstop Hill, purchased with dozens of casualties, returned to German hands. The offensive for Tunisia, launched with such confidence on November 10th, had failed completely. Mitchell spent Christmas Day, 1942, in a defensive position outside Gafsa, 300 kilometers from Tunis, exactly where he had been on November 17th. 38 days had passed. The Allies had advanced, fought, bled, and retreated. The Germans had arrived, defended, and held. The transformation from raid to siege was complete. The broader context became clear only later, as captured documents and post-war records revealed the German strategic calculus. Hitler had ordered Tunisia held at all costs, recognizing that abandoning North Africa would expose Italy to invasion and undermine Axis credibility with neutral nations. The Luftwaffe devoted over 200 transport aircraft to the Tunisia airlift, aircraft withdrawn from the Eastern Front and Mediterranean supply runs. The commitment was massive, deliberate, and successful. The Allies, meanwhile, had planned Operation Torch as a rapid exploitation, assuming Axis forces would collapse or withdraw as they had in Syria and Madagascar. The planning estimated that Tunisia would fall within weeks of the initial landings. This assumption shaped force allocation, logistics preparation, and command expectations. When the assumption proved false, the entire operational framework became obsolete. The contrast in operational methods was stark. German forces flew directly to Tunis, unloaded, and moved immediately into combat. Allied forces landed at Casablanca, Oran, or Algiers, then traveled overland, sometimes over 1,000 kilometers, to reach combat zones. German aircraft dominated the skies over Tunisia because Luftwaffe bases at Tunis were 30 kilometers from the front, while Allied bases at Bonn and Souk El Arba were 150 kilometers away. Reducing sortie rates and time over target, German supply lines ran 180 kilometers across water. Allied supply lines ran up to 1,000 kilometers overland. The mathematics were always unfavorable. Mitchell and his fellow officers simply hadn't recognized this until they were committed to the campaign. By January 1943, both sides settled into winter positions. The Allies reinforced, reorganized, and planned for renewed offensive operations in spring. The Germans fortified Tunisia's eastern approaches, extending their defensive line from Bizerta in the north to Gabes in the south. The campaign that was supposed to end by Christmas had just begun. 12 men who participated in the early Tunisia campaign later provided testimony in post-war interviews, their accounts preserved in military archives. Corporal John Hastings, British 11th Brigade. We thought we were marching to Tunis. We were actually marching into a meat grinder. The Germans were waiting, dug in, with tanks and artillery. Every hill had a machine gun nest. Every valley had anti-tank guns. We didn't understand what we were up against until we were in the middle of it. Sergeant William Price, United States 1st Armored Division. On November 28th, We lost 19 tanks at Jeddah in about 3 hours. German guns hit us from positions we couldn't see, at ranges we couldn't match. Our tanks were mechanically sound, but tactically outclassed. We learned the hard way that confidence is not a substitute for preparation. Lieutenant Richard Foster, British 36th Infantry Brigade. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. Every time we moved during daylight, we got strafed. Stukas would come in low, hit the column, and disappear before our anti-aircraft guns could track them. We started moving only at night, which slowed everything down. Meanwhile, the Germans moved whenever they wanted. Private Daniel Murphy, United States 1st Infantry Division. We were told Tunisia was lightly defended. We were told we'd be in Tunis by Thanksgiving. We were told the Germans couldn't sustain forces across the Mediterranean. Every single thing we were told was wrong. By Christmas, we were holding defensive positions and wondering how we'd gotten there. Captain William Hargrove, British 36th Infantry Brigade. I arrived at Jebel Abiod on November 17th, expecting to find a few Italian caretakers. Instead, we found German panzers and professional infantry who had clearly trained for this. They knew the ground. They had good positions. They had ammunition and fuel. We had surprise and optimism. Those aren't equal resources. Hauptmann Friedrich Wolf, German 10th Panzer Division. The Allies underestimated our logistics. They thought because they controlled the sea, they controlled access to Tunisia. But we controlled the air over the central Mediterranean, at least locally, and that was enough. Ju-52s could fly from Sicily to Tunis, unload, and return in 4 hours. The Allies took 4 days to move supplies from Algiers to the front. We won the logistics race because we chose the faster method. Private First Class Robert Santos, United States 1st Infantry Division. I was monitoring radio traffic for weeks. Every day the reports showed more German forces arriving. Every day our estimates of enemy strength increased. By mid-December, we faced an entire panzer division that supposedly didn't exist. The disconnect between intelligence and reality was terrifying. Major Richard Pemberton, British Intelligence. We failed to appreciate the implications of air transport. We calculated Axis logistics based on sea transport capacity, which was indeed limited. But the Germans weren't using ships. They were using aircraft, hundreds of them. This allowed them to build combat power faster than we could neutralize it. By the time we recognized this, they had established a fortified zone that would take months to reduce. Sergeant Thomas Brennan, United States 1st Infantry Division. Captain Mitchell saw it coming before most of us. He looked at the maps, read the reports, did the math. He understood we were walking into something bigger than expected. But we were committed. Orders were orders. So we moved forward, even though the situation was deteriorating. Colonel James Wilson, United States 1st Armored Division. The tank losses at Jeddah should have been a wake-up call. 19 tanks in one engagement is not unlucky. It's systemic. The Germans had better tactics, better positions, and better guns. We were sending Sherman tanks against dug-in anti-tank positions with 88mm guns. The outcome was predictable, but we didn't predict it. Lieutenant Commander David Walsh, Royal Navy Intelligence. The Luftwaffe's airlift operation was brilliant. They accepted high loss rates, probably 10 to 15% of sorties, but maintained operational tempo. For every transport we shot down, 3 got through. The math favored them as long as they had aircraft and pilots, and they committed both in quantities that surprised us. Private First Class Anthony Ricci, United States 1st Infantry Division. Christmas Day, 1942, we were back where we started. A month and a half of fighting, hundreds of casualties, all that optimism, and we'd gained nothing. I remember thinking, this is going to be a long war. The irony Mitchell recognized in January, reviewing the campaign, was that every piece of information required to predict the outcome had been available before the offensive began. The distance from Sicily to Tunis was known. German transport aircraft capacity was known. Allied overland logistics constraints were known. The mathematics were clear. Defenders with air transport advantage could reinforce faster than attackers with overland logistics. Disadvantage could advance. The Allies simply hadn't performed the calculation, blinded by assumptions about Axis weakness and Allied strength. Mitchell survived the Tunisia campaign, participating in the renewed offensive of spring 1943 that finally captured Tunis in May. He went on to fight in Sicily and Italy, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1958. In his post-war memoir, never published but preserved in his family's papers, he wrote about the Tunisia campaign with particular emphasis on those early days in November. We believed we understood the strategic situation. We believed our intelligence assessments. We believed in our operational plan. Every belief was wrong. The Germans taught us that modern warfare rewards logistics and tempo more than courage or numbers. They assembled an army across 180 kilometers of water, faster than we could advance 300 kilometers overland. This seemed impossible, but it happened. The lesson took thousands of casualties to learn. Never assume the enemy shares your limitations. The Tunisia campaign would last until May 13th, 1943, ending with the surrender of over 275,000 Axis troops, the largest Axis capitulation before Stalingrad. But the easy victory envisioned in November 1942 never materialized. Instead, Tunisia became a 6-month siege that consumed resources, time, and lives. The initial drive for Tunisia, launched on November 10th with such confidence, ended effectively on Christmas Day. The paradigm had shifted completely. What began as exploitation became attrition. What seemed like a race became a siege. What felt like certain victory became costly stalemate. Mitchell's discovery in that operations tent at Gafsa on November 17th that German forces were far stronger than intelligence suggested represented the first moment when reality diverged from expectation. But the full reality was more profound than even that moment revealed. The Germans were not just stronger. They were faster, better supported, and more strategically committed. The Allies were not just slower. They were operating under false assumptions about operational tempo, logistics, and enemy intentions. The photographs Mitchell studied that afternoon, showing over 100 German aircraft at Tunis, told a story the Allies weren't yet ready to hear. The Germans had won the race to Tunisia. They had arrived first in strength, with sustainability. Everything that followed, the battles, the casualties, the eventual Allied victory in May, stemmed from that fundamental miscalculation in November. History would judge the Tunisia campaign as an Allied victory, which it ultimately was. But those who fought in November and December 1942 knew a different truth. They had launched an offensive based on assumptions that were obsolete before the first shot was fired. The mathematics were against them from the beginning. They just didn't realize it until they were too committed to withdraw. The lesson resonated beyond Tunisia, shaping Allied planning for subsequent operations. Never again would commanders assume that controlling the sea meant controlling access. Never again would intelligence estimates go unchallenged by operational analysis. Never again would speed substitute for strength without verification that the race was winnable. Captain James Mitchell stood in that operations tent on November 17th, 1942. reading an intelligence summary that told him Tunis was within reach. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Tunis had never been within reach. The race had been lost before it began. The Germans had simply chosen a faster mode of transport. Today, at the American Military Cemetery in Carthage, Tunisia, 2,841 white crosses mark the graves of American soldiers who died in North Africa. Many fell during those early weeks of the Tunisia campaign, fighting for objectives that seemed achievable but proved illusory. Visitors standing among the graves sometimes ask guides about the campaign, about why it took so long to capture Tunisia. The answer is in the mathematics. The Allies could move 30 kilometers per day overland under good conditions. The Germans could move 15,000 men, 180 kilometers by air in 3 weeks. In warfare, speed matters more than distance. The Germans traveled further, faster, and arrived first. By the time the Allies reached Tunisia's borders, the race was over. The white crosses stand in silent testimony to the cost of miscalculation.